Have you ever wanted to ask me a question but just never had the chance? Would you enjoy hanging out with me in a live stream? Well, you're in luck, because tonight at 10 Eastern, 9 Central, I'm taking questions on my live show, Zadanza. Come join the fun. Well, hey everybody. So today I thought I'd do another video by Allen Parr. We previously watched him talk about how a lot of Christians are going to die and they'll wake up to be surprised that they, didn't go to the good place. So today let's lighten things up with a video exploring why the Jewish people didn't accept Jesus. No uncomfortable undertones there. I mean, even look at this thumbnail where Allen's pointing at an obviously Jewish fellow making some kind of "what's wrong with this guy" face. Yep. All right.
When Jesus came, he gave overwhelming evidence that he was the Messiah.
Of course he did.
He healed the sick. He made the deaf hear. He made the lame walk. He cured the lepers from their disease. And he even raised dead people from the grave. All of this in front of the Jewish leaders. And they also had access to all of the Old Testament prophecies about the promised Messiah, and yet they still rejected Jesus as the Messiah. The question remains, why? Why, in the midst of all the evidence, did the Jewish people reject Jesus?
So Allen's already answered one of my big questions. It's one you might have had too. And that is this video going to be about why actual Jewish people don't tend to convert to Christianity? Or will it be about why the fictional depictions of Jews in the Gospels didn't react well to the overblown accomplishments of a fictional depiction of Jesus? These are two very different questions. The first involves a more serious conversation about how an ethnic and religious minority handled living in a society dominated by another religion. Or at least it could. When handled realistically, this would likely be an examination of bald-faced claims, social and legal coercion, and cultural domination. It could show the irreconcilable differences that arise when two religions collide since, neither one can prove anything to the other since they're not based on real information. The second is a much less serious conversation that's entirely about how one character in a story did amazing things and other characters refused to believe in him. This one does nothing to help Christians understand how others see their religion and instead just gives them an easy answer for why outsiders won't accept it. So, no huge surprise this is the one Allen zeroed in on.
That's what we're going to talk about today in this video. There are many reasons why the Jewish people, by and large, rejected Jesus as the Messiah, but in this video, I'm going to give you 4 of them. And the first one is that they pretty much confused the Old Testament prophecies that talked about Jesus' first coming with Jesus' second coming.
I find it puzzling that Allen would suggest this. He says the Jews rejected Jesus not because the prophecies about him clearly said things they didn't like, but because they found the prophecies confusing. This sounds like an admission that the passages he's talking about didn't clearly predict that specific things would happen at specific times. I mean, if they did, how could anybody, much less the culture most familiar with the prophecies, read them and not know what Jesus was supposed to do when? This kind of confusion could only arise from vague Nostradamus-like nonsense that Christians interpreted after the fact to suit their needs.
There were many prophecies about the Messiah that Jesus fulfilled at his first coming. Prophecies like the character of the Messiah in Isaiah chapter 11. Prophecies about where the Messiah would be born in Micah 5:2. Exactly how the Messiah would suffer and die, Isaiah 53. And also down to the precise timing of when the Messiah was going to come in Daniel chapter 9, verses 24 through 27. We know all about those.
This is pretty basic stuff, and Christians do it all the time. Allen just declares that Jesus fulfilled certain passages and then immediately starts running victory laps without explaining why. But these passages aren't about Jesus at all. Isaiah 11 and Micah 5 just foretell the coming of an unidentified leader who will restore Israel to its former glory. The imagery they use is pretty generic, and the only specific language makes it clear they're talking about a military chieftain providing military leadership, and doing this within the socio-political situation of the time. So, not about Jesus, except maybe in a way that's so figurative it's meaningless. Isaiah 53 absolutely does not describe exactly how Jesus died. There's nothing about a guy on a cross, and it doesn't give anything close to the sequence of events in Jesus' trial or execution. It's just generic descriptions of suffering. And as for Allen's claim that Daniel 9 gives us the precise timing of when the Messiah would come, that's just incredibly dumb. And in fact, it's so dumb you won't fully appreciate it until you absorb the entire passage. So let's take a moment to hear what it has to say. We're going to hear it read by one of my favorite voices on the internet, Tony Reed. Take it away, Tony.
77s are decreed for your people and your holy city to finish transgression, to put an end to sin, to atone for wickedness, to bring in everlasting happiness, to seal up vision and prophecy, and to anoint the most holy place. Know and understand this. From the time the word goes out to restore and rebuild Jerusalem until the Anointed One, the ruler, comes, there will be 7 sevens and 62 sevens. It will be rebuilt with streets and a trench, but in times of trouble. After 62 sevens, the Anointed One will be put to death and will have nothing. The people of the ruler who come will destroy the city and the sanctuary. The end will come like a flood. War will continue until the end, and desolations have been decreed. He will confirm a covenant with many for 1 7. In the middle of the 7 he will put an end to sacrifice and offering. And at the temple he will set up an abomination that causes desolation, until the end that is decreed is poured out on him.
So yeah, try squeezing a precise date out of that. If you do come up with a date, I guarantee you started with it in mind and made that absurd sequence of 7s mean what you needed it to get yourself there. This is all just incredibly silly. And let's remember that it would be for nothing if these prophecies were just absolutely brilliant anyway. Because even if something specific pans out, say Jesus being born in Bethlehem, all that proves is that the gospel writers were familiar with the book of Micah and made sure to, write that Jesus was born in Bethlehem.
But the problem is, in spite of all of these, in addition to all of these, there were all sorts of other prophecies in the Old Testament that Jesus did not fulfill at his first coming. And these were the ones that the Jewish leaders were looking at and focusing on. And when they saw that Jesus wasn't fulfilling these, they said, nah, man, he can't be the Messiah. We need to reject him because the Messiah is going to do the following things.
Where in the Gospels does it say they rejected it for those reasons? I've read the Gospels many times and I don't recall it. Maybe they rejected Jesus because the reasons he gave for being the fulfillment of prophecy were just vague and stupid. Or here's an even better one. Maybe neither of these things really happened and Allen's just talking about fictional Jews instead of actual Jews. Which, as I've been hinting, kind of makes this all pointless.
Now, the key to understand this is to know that the Old Testament prophets did not understand that there was going to be a gap or an interval of time between the first coming or first advent of the Messiah and the second. This was a concept that was hidden from them.
Is Allen trying to trip over his shoelaces on purpose? If the prophets didn't know there was going to be a gap between Jesus' comings, then this information wouldn't be in their prophecies. In fact, Allen's point is that it wasn't in the prophecies, right? So then where is the information? Allen's pretty much implicitly admitting he's just reading interpretations into these passages after the fact.
And so when Jesus came and he did not fulfill all of the Old Testament prophecies about the Messiah at his first coming, they said this guy cannot be the Messiah. As a matter of fact, this gap between Jesus' first coming and second coming was something that Paul referred to as a mystery that was kept hidden from all previous generations and was only revealed to Paul. Notice what he says. He says, when you read this, you can perceive my insight into the mystery of Christ. Here it is, which was not made known to the sons of men in other generations, as it has now been revealed to his holy apostles and prophets by the Spirit.
And so, yeah, now he goes from implicitly admitting it to explicitly admitting it. Because here he's literally saying that Paul just reinterpreted these prophecies in hindsight. This means they're totally ineffectual at predicting the future, which means they're not prophecies in any useful sense of the word. This makes this whole thing pretty silly, but it becomes rather insidious when you consider this is about why the Jews didn't accept Jesus. Because let's think about what Allen's expecting of them, considering the fact that, According to him, Jesus wasn't even fulfilling their prophecies in any way they'd recognize. This means that Allen's suggesting they should have drastically overhauled their own faith, all because some guy in a rogue breakaway sect declared that it was revealed to him that these prophecies mean something totally different than what they seem to say and even what the authors intended for them to say. This is an incredibly wild expectation. I mean, could you imagine Allen or any other Christian converting to what amounts to a new religion because some guy came along and said it was revealed to him that the Bible means something other than what it says? Yet here he's twisting himself into knots, puzzling over why the Jews wouldn't do the same thing. Allen goes on about point 1, but all he does is sift through Old Testament scriptures and insist that Jesus was only supposed to fulfill prophecies in some metaphorically spiritual way during his first coming. It's arbitrary and tedious, and the point's already been made, so let's skip to point 2.
The second major reason that the Jewish people, by and large, rejected Jesus as the Messiah is, if I'm being honest, they saw him as a blasphemer, right?
He's about to go into way too much detail about the prayers the Jews performed, but it's all to get to this point here about how they only worshipped one God.
They understood from a young age that God is one. There is no other God other than Yahweh. Worship him and love him alone. And here Jesus comes talking about, no, you need to worship me. You need to serve me. You need to love me. Right? You need to honor me. And they were like, no. This goes against what I've been taught as a young Jewish person, that you are God, that God could actually come down from heaven and take on the form of a man. All of this was just too much for the Jewish people.
So they'd grown up in a religion that drilled them in a bunch of foundational teachings about God. So when some guy came by and contradicted it all, they really didn't like it. Is there anything mysterious about this? I mean, sure, I don't like religious dogma, and I think getting angry about blasphemy is, bad. But I can at least see where the reaction comes from. So I'd think you'd understand it all the more if you're someone like Allen who has your own ideas about dogma and blasphemy. Now yes, his explanation gives some insight into this, but there's something about the way he over-explains it that shows he's puzzled by the obvious. And underneath it all is this kind of weird wrestling with the issue as if the Jews were clearly on the wrong side and knew it because they didn't convert. The key thing here, and the one that shows Allen's really not comprehending this whole thing, is that we're not exactly seeing a ton of acknowledgement that he'd feel the same way if some guy went through churches saying he was God in a way that contradicted the Bible. I don't know. It just seems like he's taking a weird tack here that's not grasping the really simple idea that people of all religions don't like being contradicted. I'll skip the rest of this one and move to reason 3. You'll notice I do that a lot because he makes his entire point at the start and then just trails off into aimless rambling. I guess you can go watch the original if you don't believe me.
The third reason why Jewish people, by and large, rejected Jesus as the Messiah was because Jesus was challenging some of their religious teachings and some of their religious traditions. Many of Jesus' teachings they considered to have contradicted much of the Old Testament.
They didn't just consider Jesus to have contradicted the Old Testament. He often did contradict it. It was basically formulaic for him to say, "It has been said that," and then something from the Old Testament, "but I say," and then something that contradicts it. This happens so obviously, so often on such major issues, that throwing in "they considered" here seems like Allen's trying to minimize how much Jesus was overturning the Jews' religion and make it sound like it was all just a perception problem on their part.
You have to remember that these rabbis were passing down laws outside of the Old Testament from generation down to generation.
Yep, here it is. He's trying to make it sound like the Jewish leaders were wandering off course by making up their own rules, and that Jesus was just mainly correcting their extra-biblical nonsense. Not only is this not entirely accurate, but it assumes Jews should have been exclusively following texts that were later canonized by Christians, rather than having their own collection of traditions as the foundation of their own religion.
So when Jesus comes and starts challenging some of their sacred laws and some of their sacred traditions and practices, this put them immediately on the defensive as if to say, who is this guy to come and now bring some sort of new law or new teaching to our hearing?
Yeah, of course it did. You know, just like it would put Allen on the defensive if some guy came in and started changing his religion's sacred teachings. But somehow he thinks the Jews should have had a totally different reaction. Go figure. This is basically the same issue brought up in Reason 2, except it's about the heresy of changing teachings instead of the blasphemy of claiming to be God. So let's just skip 5 minutes of convoluted rationalizations for why Jesus wasn't contradicting actual Hebrew law, and I'll skip to kind of an ugly remark he makes at the end.
So the more Jesus started teaching these things that were contrary to what their religious leaders were teaching, the leaders started to feel threatened and felt the need to control because they did not want members of the Jewish faith to start following Jesus.
Yeah, they didn't want members of their faith following some guy teaching weird new things, just like Allen, I presume, wouldn't want Christians following some guy who walked into a church and did the same. Now, is this because of a need to control? I don't know, maybe partially. But I'm sure there's also an element of sincere concern over what you feel to be false teachings entering your community. And if that's true for Allen, it's probably true for the Jews. There's a major yuck factor in Allen ignoring that and acting like the Jews just wanted to control people.
Now, as I said, there are many other reasons as to why Jesus was rejected as the Messiah, but let me give you the fourth and final one we're going to talk about in this video, and that is simply that their hearts were hardened towards the truth.
Huh. This sounds a little different all of a sudden. I mean, why'd he bother taking all that time saying the Jews' reactions were understandable for reasons 1, 2, and 3? If he was just going to turn around and say they all have hard hearts, then all that other stuff was mostly superfluous, if not contradictory. Kinda sounds like he opened by being diplomatic and is now getting real with his Christian attitude about Jews.
And one of the ways that we can see this is in John chapter 11, where Jesus raises a dead man from the grave who had been dead for 4 days. His name is Lazarus. So notice the response of the Jewish people after Jesus raises a man from the dead, something that you would think, if you saw this, only God can do such a miracle.
No. That's not a natural conclusion at all. I mean, if I saw something that was supposed to be a miracle, I would just think, wow, that's weird, and acknowledge I have no idea what caused it. But I know Allen's perspective is going to be different because he's religious. So let's imagine he saw members of another religion raising someone from the dead. Would he think those people were gods or acting on behalf of gods? I generally hesitate to speak for others, but in this case I think it's safe to assume an absolute no. I doubt it would shake his Christian faith at all. And in fact, he'd probably pretty easily come up with some explanation regarding fakery that would accommodate his beliefs or sorcery that would reinforce them. Yet he expects Jews to react to the same experience by tossing their entire religion out the window and following Jesus. Right.
But notice how they responded. Many of the people who were with Mary believed in Jesus when they saw this happen, but some went to the Pharisees and told them what Jesus had done. So instead of saying, hey, you know what? I just saw something that I've never seen before, something that only God can do. So you know what? Regardless of what I've believed before, this dude has just proven that he is God in the flesh. He is the Messiah. So let me place my faith in him. No.
So when Allen first said, only God can do such a miracle, I held back, giving him the benefit of assuming he just expected the Jews to think God was doing the miracle by working through Jesus, and not necessarily that Jesus was actually God himself. But no. He's explicit in saying that they were supposed to jump straight to thinking the first person they saw do a resurrection was God. Not only is this completely unreasonable, it's just bizarrely untenable even within Christianity. I mean, Peter raised someone from the dead. Elijah raised someone from the dead. Was everybody supposed to think they were God? It's weird.
Instead of that, they had this long, drawn-out conversation about how they could stop Jesus, how they could control him, and ultimately how they could kill him. Notice it says here, from that time on, the Jewish leaders began to plot Jesus' death. Listen, the reality as to why the Jewish people rejected Jesus as the Messiah was because they did not want to believe. Their hearts were hardened towards the truth. They even went as far as to claim that Jesus was doing all of these miraculous things by the power of Satan himself.
Yeah, kind of like what you'd think if you saw a member of another religion doing a miracle. It's a retort I've made a lot, but the truth behind it just shows how incredibly strange point 4 is. It's all built on a story from Allen's own book of scripture, which is useless for understanding anything real about non-Christians. Because of course it's going to say its core figures did miracles. Of course it's going to say other people saw those miracles and still chose not to believe. These are the kinds of things religions always tell themselves when trying to come up with self-reinforcing narratives about outsiders. And yet Allen still can't even get this right. He gives himself the liberty of dealing with fictional Jews reacting to a fictional depiction of a miracle by Jesus. And even then, he biffs it when trying to comprehend where they're coming from. What it comes down to is that he's tripping up on, or trying to capitalize on, two of the most basic temptations fundamentalist believers run into when ostensibly trying to understand people outside their religion. One is to see outsiders through the lens of their own stories, to assume they have access to the supernatural evidence those stories fantasize about, and that they just reject it because their hearts are as evil as the antagonists from those stories. The other is to see them through the lens of your belief structure instead of theirs. To say, I see my religion as right, therefore they should see my religion as right, instead of, I see my religion as right because it's the one I happened into, therefore I should expect others to see their religion as right because it's the one they happened into. The failure to extend this basic consideration to others is the driving force behind this entire video. And it's a huge reason why fundamentalists struggle to get along with and understand others. Until they grasp the actual reasons they're in their own religion, including coming to some terms with a tenuous justification for belief in it, they're never going to understand why others are in their religions. Thus, they'll hold on to onerous demands of those people and see them as wicked when they don't meet those demands. Now, the sad thing is all it takes to get past this is some basic reflection. But I guess the problem is that it's the kind of reflection that leads to deconstruction. And they sure don't need that. This program was made possible by a grant from John Adams, Bob Generic, Maggie Danger, S.R. Foxley, Daniel Bostedt, Magnus Holmgren, and Q, and by the generous support of viewers like you. If you'd like to join them in pledging to this channel, please find a link to the Prophet of Zod Patreon below.